Ben. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We've got a fab lineup of speakers for this session. We have Joanna Conway, a partner of internet regulation and legal at Deloitte. Bradley Tusk, co-founder and managing partner of Tusk Venture Partners. Arvind Gupta, president of the Digital India Foundation. And we are also hugely grateful to Anna-Liisa Pärnalaas, the Counsellor for Digital and Cyber Policy of the Permanent Representation of Estonia to the EU, for stepping in at late notice as Minister Koritnik, the Minister of Public Administration and the government of Slovenia, has had to step away and pre-record his contribution. So I think the session is planned. We will move into questions shortly, but Ben, if we can now start playing the pre-recorded session contribution from the Minister, then for everyone to see, that would be great.
Dear participants of the conference, it is my great pleasure and honor to be at this very important event and to discuss the topic of trust in digital technology. In Slovenia, we firmly believe that digitalization should improve the quality of public services and should make life easier for our citizens. Therefore, digital transformation, digital technology and cybersecurity are very high on our government agenda. However, we should not forget, with new technologies, trust is a must. I believe that fears related to the use of digital technology are overcome when citizens become aware of the huge benefits and potentials that digital services bring to their everyday life. In my speech, I will focus on two important elements that can significantly increase trust of citizens in digital technology. First is their inclusion in service creation, and the second is data openness. At the EU level, a number of legislative acts have been adopted or are in the legislative procedure with a view to protecting citizens when it comes to the use of digital technology or to the promotion of digital services. In this regard, I would like to mention the Digital Services Act. The Act follows the principles that what is illegal offline must also be illegal online. It will, by all means, bring more trust in technology, since it will make the internet a safer space for European citizens. And therefore, internet users and their fundamental rights will be better protected, as well as rules in the internal EU market will be better defined. As I already mentioned, an important aspect of trust in digital technology is inclusion. I firmly believe we can have user-friendly services, apps, and solutions only by creating them together with users. Consequently, inclusion of citizens in the process of creation helps increase their trust in public services and in the government. In Slovenia, we have some excellent examples of services co-created with our citizens. One example are subsidized transport tickets for students that are completely digitalized. This service was developed with the Ministry of Infrastructure, end users, and bus companies. We succeeded in reducing personal contact and waiting lines. The whole process is fast, efficient, and is a good case of co-creation. Another good example is electronic sick leave, introduced just before the COVID lockdown and extremely useful in both public and private sector. The solution is also completely digitalized. All information is now shared electronically between doctors, employers, and health insurance without any role of the employee. The business portal Spot is used as a platform for this information exchange and serves as transparency tool where employees can have insight into their own health insurance data. The digitalized service has also big cost savings, estimated to 11.5 million euros yearly. Last, but certainly not least element that contributes to trust in digital technology I would like to mention is openness of data. Last year, the European Commission published the Open Data Maturity Report, where Slovenia was ranked first in the open data policy category and ninth in the overall marking. In Slovenia, we firmly believe that if data is not in conflict with the interest of an individual or a business entity, it is a public good. And therefore, we strive to open as many public data as possible in order to enhance transparency of our public administration. For example, we have an online presentation of the state budget where citizens can see daily how much the state has spent and for what and how much revenue it has generated. One of the most prominent tools is the application ERAR, developed by the Slovenian Commission for the Prevention of Corruption. It enables full transparency of financial flows from the public to private sector and is at the disposal of the general public. We also constantly collaborate with universities and students who have developed or created various open data applications as part of their study programs. We also motivate municipalities with financial incentives to unify solutions in terms of opening data and interoperability. We have also set up an open data ecosystem where data providers and data users meet. In 2019, the Open Data Hub Slovenia was established, and this hub integrates businesses, state and innovators in producing new innovative products. It is where cutting-edge technologies converge, the best development companies meet, and new technology stories emerge. Ladies and gentlemen, digital technology already has and will surely have an important impact on the quality of life of all of us. It is up to the governments and also private sector to ensure that citizens will have greater trust in digital technology. Since with this trust, we will be able to build the institutions and create the services we need for our better future. Thank you.
So we heard some tremendous examples from the minister there on building trust. If I can now open it up to the panel with the first question, and we have a panel from all across the world, and to get their views on what is being done within their region for building trust. So if I can ask Bradley first, the minister referred to it's both government and private sector for a key part of building trust. Is that a similar approach to what the US is adopting?
No, I mean, sadly, I wish I could say that we in the U.S. were doing a lot of what we see in the EU, but we're not. The U.S., in my view, has really dropped the ball on data privacy, on platform liability, on antitrust. And keep in mind, I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in technology companies to make money, so I'm by no means anti-tech. But for me at least, early stage companies that can provide real innovation and real disruption and real change have a much harder time competing when we have these giant monopolies that have no regulations around them. And so, yeah, the U.S. government has dropped the ball completely, in my view.
Okay, and Arvind, can we get your view of how India is approaching building trust and the role of government and the private sector?
I think I will be less brief than Bradley here because I first of all very much appreciate his candid views on this from a U.S. perspective, because I think what the minister talked and set the tone for this panel discussion. I kind of very much agree with that. The public and the private sector has to come together to build trust in technology. And let me give you my thoughts on this. The U.S., as Bradley has also said, has this Silicon Valley model, which is, in the absence of regulation, in absence, and in the name of innovation, correctly so, a lot of data is used to monetize, and the trust is really not there. We've seen it in the recent takeover of Twitter, that there is absolutely lack of transparency in algorithms. So the opaqueness of the machine, opaqueness of the systems, and the few engineers controlling it, lack of regulation is causing that lack of trust in technology, and that also is a source of a lot of misinformation and whatever else you want to think about it. And the second model is the Chinese model, which is the model of the Shenzhen Valley model, which is basically built very large mammoth or corporations, platforms and technologies, which really build upon in their own with the national backing, and then use that capital to go and invest in other companies. And when that also happens, that there is a lack of trust today in consumers, because then it is branded as some data is being shared outside their own national region. So there is this two extreme models and views. What India has done is exactly walk the middle path, which is create digital public goods. The whole approach in India has been that digital access and platforms are public goods under the public scrutiny, under democratic norms, and they're shareable to everybody. To give you an example, our identity platform, which actually serves as a digital identity to 1.4 billion Indians, is a open public good, which means governments access it equally, private sector accesses, banks access it, startups access it equally, and it's completely under public scrutiny. Everybody, any small data supposedly pilferage that happens comes under scrutiny there. So there's a lot of scrutiny there. Um, and it's built as a public-private partnership. And that's the approach India has taken. That now onwards, all platforms, whether they are payment platforms, they are identity platforms, document platforms, document sharing platforms, KYC platforms, digital commerce platforms, health platforms, are built with this digital public goods approach. And that is finding credibility with and thus trust with most of the consumers, because they end up using it. And I don't want to take more time, but the vaccination platform that India built was built with the same spirit. It's a common public good, not only built for India. It was actually exported to more than 25 countries as a public good. So and that we feel lends a lot of credibility and trust to the citizens that use it.
Thank you. Anna-Liisa, we've heard from the minister about some of the EU approach and some of the examples within his country. Do you have anything to add on the EU approach from your perspective, particularly around the Digital Services Act, and how it applies, what you've been doing in Estonia?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. I will try to open the EU approach in a bit more detail. We actually have several examples, but yeah, perhaps the most prominent or famous one at the moment is the Digital Services Act, that was already mentioned by Mr. Koritnik also. And I mean, what it is an EU regulation. I would say its impacts are probably wider, and the approach that is taken there is quite ambitious as well. And we talk about customer trust in the digital space. I mean, that is one of the main aims of the regulation, is to create a safer digital space for fundamental rights of users and customers of digital services are protected. For example, the regulation aims to protect people against the spread of online illegal content, which I would say it's especially important when we look at the geopolitical situation that we have here today. But it also prohibits some misleading interfaces that are also known as dark patterns, and it also creates some additional transparency requirements for example, for recommendation systems and so on. So in general, it creates, I would say, this kind of a horizontal framework of rules that define the responsibilities and obligations of providers of digital services, especially online platforms in particular. So yeah, I would say that one of the important aspects of this proposal is that it allows us to avoid fragmentation of the digital single market that would happen if every member state would start to apply their own rules. So in this regard, this horizontal framework is it's very welcomed. But I would say that when we try to compare different regional approaches to consumer trust, for example, between EU and USA, I think DSA is not the only one where there is, at least at the moment, some considerable differences. I would say AI Act perhaps is another good example, where we in the EU have at the moment chosen a approach that basically creates trust through regulation to make sure that EU systems are developed and used in the EU market, that they are safe and trustworthy. So yeah, I would say these are like two biggest, most famous examples. But I guess, you know, in the context of DSA, AI, and also other proposals, if we choose the regulatory approach, it often comes to finding the optimal balance to, on the one hand, try to ensure customer trust, safety, increase transparency, but also on the other hand, to make sure that these measures are proportionate, that we don't set up walls for our own SMEs and businesses. So therefore, you know, like trying to balance between different rights and yeah, so this is also one of the important aspects, I would say.
Thank you. And Joanna, last but not least, I know you'll probably have a view on the Digital Services Act as well, but can you kind of summarise where we are in the UK, no longer part of the EU, and perhaps the piggy in the middle between the US and the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree very much with what Anna-Liisa said, and how the EU's approach is really around creating trust through regulation. The UK is doing something similar. It's actually gone quite a bit further, arguably, than the Digital Services Act in relation to content and regulating the internet. So we've recently had a revised draft of our online safety bill. Now, the stated intention of the UK government with that is to make the UK the safest place in the world to go online through this regulation. And it goes further in the sense that it's not just looking at illegal content, but it also brings in provisions around harmful content. So that is content that's not actually illegal in any specific law, but can still cause harm, which could, for instance, be material inciting self-harm or potentially some sorts of misinformation. There's also a focus on children in that measure. So that really is going potentially further even than the EU. In other respects, though, I'd say the UK is slightly further behind the EU. So the EU's obviously brought out its Digital Markets Act, which is aimed at regulating competition in the space, which touches on Bradley's point around sort of how do you build trust when there are very large players in the arena already. So the EU's Digital Markets Act is aimed at addressing that. We're waiting to see the extent of the UK's proposals around that. And similarly, obviously, we've got the AI Act, which has been mentioned, and data provisions. We're slightly further behind, I would say, in the UK on those. But it's the same model. It's the model of creating trust through regulation. In terms of how that enables interactions with the tech companies themselves and individuals, it's interesting that a lot of these new measures, these new laws, provide for flexibility around things like codes of conduct, which is where the regulators will be engaging a lot with the tech companies, SMEs right through to big tech, to try and devise what best practice should be, and that's then going to be crystallized in the codes. And those codes come up under various measures. So I think through conversations with the regulators, we will see that interaction with the private sector, and therefore they're sort of bringing forth what should be best practice and what everybody should be doing.
And just following on from that, Joey, what are the tech companies doing to stay on top of the regulations? Because we've just heard there's a plethora of them, all taking different approaches. So what are they doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Deloitte, we're obviously working with companies in this space, and it's really important to have a systematic approach to this, because these laws and regulations are coming so fast from so many jurisdictions at the same time. And unfortunately, because of that, because of the impetus and the need for these laws to come in, the political pressure and societal pressure behind it, it does mean you end up in a fragmented landscape. So even between the EU and UK, such close partners, I've already explained how the online safety bill is actually going to be different from the Digital Services Act. So it does mean you need a systematic approach. You need to be monitoring for these laws and regulations, following them through from inception and at the point where you might be able to influence them still, right through the legislative journey, and making sure you are making the right assessments as they progress to be able to comply with them when they come in. And that includes, obviously, impact assessments, risk assessments, and then setting up a compliance, a trust and safety function that can cope with doing that. So that therefore, when these things land, when they crystallize, you're able to ensure compliance, measure compliance, and meet your obligations. And we're seeing people do it various ways, Emma.
Brilliant, thank you. And Joey just touched on kind of whether regulation or self-regulation works and what the approaches are. Bradley, do you have a view, particularly if we look at some of the whistleblowers coming out of some of the social media companies? Do you have a view as to what would work best? I suspect you do.
Yeah, I do. And look, yeah, I unfortunately, look, there are industries and sectors where self-regulation, I think, can work pretty well and even does work pretty well. But if you look at this case, especially around Facebook, they have been saying now for well over a decade, you don't need to regulate us. We'll take care of everything ourselves. We'll moderate content. We'll prevent harm. And they have done absolutely nothing along those lines whatsoever. So I think self-regulation means you have to have some level of trust in the people who are doing the self-regulation. And I don't think they deserve any trust whatsoever. And so as a result, it then comes to the US government and says, what should we do instead? And so the one piece of good news is Facebook has kind of done the impossible in the United States. They've united the Democrats and Republicans together against them by making everyone so upset. And so there is some hope that some of the different laws that we're talking about right now, like for example, it's a corollary of what you have in the Digital Services Act. It's called Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act in the US. It immunizes platforms like Facebook and Twitter from liability based on the content posted by the users. Repealing that would probably have a material effect on improving content moderation and reducing toxicity on the sites. We don't have any version of GDPR in the US yet. Facebook and the others have done a good job politically in fighting it off. But the state of California has done something, and there is bipartisan support for that. And finally, there's even legislation in Congress right now, both in the House and the Senate, that has bipartisan support for new antitrust measures, which would really limit the ability of the giant platforms to force users to continue using their products and their products only. So, yeah, I don't think we can trust self-regulation in this case, and I do think that we have solutions. We just need to act on them.
Thank you. And Arvind, do you have how about in India? Is there a role for self-regulation?
Yeah, excellent points. And I think India has done a two-pronged approach. We have the intermediary act within our Information Technology Act, the overall provision, which basically gives social media platforms, which are acting as intermediaries, certain protection from liability, and that protection. Using that provisions, what India has announced is that you get protected only if you comply with certain guidelines, and those guidelines are really empowering the consumers, the citizens, the users on the platform with a grievance redressal, local following the local laws. Three, bringing out a monthly transparency report, which ensures that there is if they are banning or deactivating certain accounts, there is a reason put to it, and there is of course a redressal mechanism. It's not it just happened because the algorithm said so. So that is one place. And second is for the content. There is a three-layered SRO mechanism that has been put in place, the self-regulation mechanism, which is, first is the industry level regulatory mechanism. The second is industry plus the government. If it escalates from the industry, it goes to the industry plus government, and the third is then if it even escalates beyond that, there is a intergovernmental interministerial committee, which then reviews the content or what is the issue at hand would be. So India is attempting and giving the agile regulatory kind of powers to the industry, to the associations. The challenge in that, though, is, and I must admit, is that a lot of these SROs are themselves sometimes at heads on with each other, because they, the industry, they're kind of represented by the industry associations, which are then funded by their own interests, if I may put. So that sometimes defeats the purpose. But the government has given a three-tiered approach to how the content by itself can be, more safe content can be put there, anything harmful can be removed, and there is a mechanism for redressal. And then the regulatory framework for the platforms to come out with a transparency report, to have local compliance officers, to have local legal officers, local grievance redressal officers, and that's a mandate for any platform having more than 5 million users in India.
Anna-Liisa, I know you have a lot of experience of government moving to digital solutions. Do you have any tips or any takeaways of how you go about building trust in those solutions?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I just may add on top of what was discussed previously, I think when we talk about self-regulation, it depends really on the specific topic or problem that we're trying to solve. For example, if we have a basic legal basis in place, this allows us, at least in the EU or in Estonia, to have this kind of discussion. For example, if sometimes guidelines on how to implement the existing regulation can be enough. So yeah, just to add to previous discussions. But on Estonian level, I mean, yes, I mean the focus is often on the regulation, how to have different requirements and safeguards in place to avoid some negative aspects that can result in decreased trust in the eyes of citizens. For example, algorithmic bias or data breaches or fraud in online environment, fake news, and so on. So there's quite a list. So basically, how to avoid harm caused by the use of technology is often the main area of discussion. And while these are all very important aspects and questions, what is usually not in the center of discussions, at least it seems to be that way, is how can we use technology to build that trust? For example, by the implementation of privacy technologies and by having different digital solutions in place that would allow citizens to get an overview of, for example, how the data is used, who uses that, and also to determine the purposes and conditions of the use. So yeah, and I would also like to add that the trust in digital government it's not guaranteed, and if we don't increase the awareness of people on the functioning of digital solutions, and this also includes data processing and transparency of solutions is low, it may reduce the trust in the future, and also create a digital divide. So this can also mean that the number of non-users and people who are skeptical towards new digital solutions, services, whatever, will continue to grow. So I think this is one important obstacle that needs addressing, not only on national level but also on EU level. And just one more point: once the trust is lost or the confidence is decreased, it's very, very hard to get it back. So therefore, maintaining the high level, at least basic cybersecurity capacity is crucial, because otherwise it's not possible to continue relying on digital solutions to the extent we have done so far. So this is something we really feel on the national level, but I guess it's it applies in both public and private sector. And of course, on top of what we're doing on national level, there's there are so many different initiatives proposals on the table today on the EU level that basically try to solve the same issue to increase trust. For example, we have the European Digital Identity Framework, which, at least from our national perspective, it's a very important one, because in addition to enabling cross-border services, it also helps us to develop further the data economy by enabling people to have better control and manage the processing of their data, for example, health data and other sensitive types of data. So yeah, a lot going on.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting discussion around this self-regulation versus government, or codes versus government regulation. And there seems to be a turning towards, well, actually, the social media companies aren't doing it, but are we really in a position where we want the government to regulate the content that we see? And I don't know do any of our panelists have a view? Who is the right policeman or policewoman in this area, and whether any panelists have a view on this?
The tech companies are definitely not. They are not the arbitrators of truth. Yeah, I mean, that's number one. I can tell you who is not the arbitrator of truth. Facebook, Twitter, all the big tech platforms cannot arbitrate truth. Democracies, laws of democracies, local laws are supreme. And I think that's the first recognition we need to do. And that's the most important one. Who is the arbitrator? Sorry.
No, I was going to say, it's what's really interesting is I was out in DC a couple of weeks ago speaking to various congressmen and women, and their deep concern is how social media companies are affecting elections, but no one has the answer to it.
Well, I think that's going to be the biggest challenge of our times. The answer lies we are the ones who have given our data so freely in exchange for free products and free applications that is being used against us to sell advertising in the name of advertising. Is being used to kind of tell us how we consume, what we consume, when we consume it, to everything along the path. So I think the challenge really is, I mean, if you ask me, and I use it in double quotes, when you can hack the brain, why hack the machine? So these platforms have really hacked our brain in a common sense, and I think governments have to recognize that these have immense. And I'm glad that the U.S. Washington is realizing it. Because they let it loose, as Bradley also says. They are the first ones who let it loose, and they now want to rein it back. And it's countries like India actually have recognized this long back. I have led the biggest social media campaign for the government, and you can see India is 1.4 billion people, and we recognized this way back 7 or 8 years ago that platforms have the power to change the path of democracy, and in that we have been slowly bringing around reforms or regulation which does not stifle innovation, which does not restrict things, but we protect our own interest, national sovereignty. One of the actions India did was to actually ban digital influence operations originating out of our neighboring country to the east of us. So most of the Chinese technology platforms were banned from India because we found them influencing exactly what I just talked about. And more so, we extended it further to make sure that with the guidelines, with the transparency reports, the accountability that is being sought from the platforms has increased. Has it solved all the problems? Probably not. But a path has started, and a thinking has started.
And Emma, I would just say, I think your point's a really good one around who's the right person to be regulating. And it's very important to keep in mind how difficult some of these issues are. We're obviously focusing in on content issues online, but there are fundamental rights engaged there. So rights of freedom of expression, freedom of speech are engaged. And if you think about the sheer volume of data that's on the internet, it is no easy thing to firstly detect that, monitor it, and then determine where the balance lies between someone's legitimate rights to say what they want to say, freedom of speech, versus harmful or even illegal content. And as someone who specializes in illegal and other content risks, if you just look at the UK as an example, there are at least 30 different laws that apply to whether or not something is illegal online. And it is not an easy thing to necessarily work out where that balance is or whether something's illegal in the first place. So I think we do have to take that in mind. In terms of who should regulate, obviously the UK, the EU, other jurisdictions as well, we're seeing a move towards regulation, so away from self-regulation. But a lot of the emphasis in those laws is actually around transparency and accountability, and that's how they're building trust. So they're not necessarily being prescriptive and saying, you, social media company, need to do X, Y, and Z. What they're saying is you need to be transparent about what you are doing, and you need to be accountable. So if you are saying in your terms and conditions and your user guidelines that this sort of content is unacceptable, you need to then stand by that and be consistent in it. And then, you need to then allow people to complain, to challenge you. You need to have complaints processes, etc. So it's not purely down to the regulator. The regulators aren't going to be making decisions on specific pieces of content. It is actually going to be the platforms and the tech companies. Although it's not self-regulation, they are going to be held to their own standards. So in a way, they are going to be still moderating themselves in that very difficult environment.
Thank you. Has anyone out of any of the other panelists, Anna or Bradley, got anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, just this is a very probably U.S. specific solution, but we live in a very litigious country here. I'm not sure that it's the same where you are, and I do believe that if liability were taken away, or liability protection were taken away from the platforms, the plaintiffs bar would sue in each occasion, and ultimately through that, the judiciary would develop a clear sense of where liability starts, where it ends, what the responsibilities are for the content platforms, what they're not. And so mostly in the US, we view litigation as just sort of a tax or a harm. But I think in this particular case, having a system with a very active plaintiffs bar can actually help us get to the right solution faster.
Thank you. Anna-Liisa, do you have anything to add? Or?
Well, nothing specific, but I really agree with what Joanna pointed out earlier regarding that the final decision in each specific case, it's in the hands of the person or on the platform, basically. And well, content moderation as such, it's even if we have a solid legal basis through regulation, it's still a very sensitive question, because I mean, this is just like a general framework which gives guidance, but it doesn't say what is the right decision in each specific case. So it's a very, very difficult topic to discuss.
And on this kind of outcome and transparency and information approach, I suppose that the risk is in the EU and the UK a bit with GDPR, and I don't know whether this will also apply to India. You've got potentially a David and Goliath scenario where the regulators are ill-equipped against the teams that are geared towards focusing on these issues in the large tech companies. Do you have so that won't necessarily be the enforcement, won't necessarily be the solution. Are there other solutions that we can look towards apart from skilling, building out our regulators, like the Information Commissioner's Office had to do post GDPR, that we can that might get us there? For instance, Anna, you talked about incorporating users' views in tech and some of the solutions around that. Does anyone have any views?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's a move generally in relation to the internet to democratize it more, and that's one of the impetuses behind Web3, for instance. And certainly we're seeing clients thinking about this, because these tech companies do want to gain trust and safety with their users. It's going to be important, particularly as they move forward. So if you can involve users in those decisions and help them understand. So we've seen a progression in the UK from, for example, where you have social media groups, the moderators being placed under greater legal obligations to moderate what content within that group. So that's users like you and I who control a group. And that's just a basic principle of law here. But we're seeing sort of experiments around that, looking at if you involve people in deciding, well, what is or is not harmful content, what should we do about it, then you gain the trust of the users. Because let's be honest, when you moderate content, there can be an inflammatory action when you do that. So if you take down content or demote it, then users can be incensed around freedom of speech and also saying that they're entitled to see what they want to see. So it might be that through engagement with users, you come to a view where actually the best thing to do in this case would be to flag this information as potentially harmful and provide counterfactuals and counter views. But if you've had the buy-in and from the users when you do that, then you know that you're actually hitting the right notes, because these are incredibly difficult issues. But personal view, I don't think that one's for the platforms to solve on their own, which goes back to your point, Emma, about who should be solving this and putting the obligations on the platforms to say, right, you go and balance illegal content, what is harmful, what is freedom of expression, and you make that work is really difficult. So engaging the users is one way to try and do that in a way where you gain trust from the users.
And does that mean, because ultimately when we say about the takedown, it's an algorithm really that's flagging this, dealing with it. Is there anything around? Are there any issues that kind of raises? For instance, Arvind, have you got issues in India where you've used algorithms in your public services that have either taken the trust away, or you found that there are decisions that are being churned out that are incorrect? And then what does that do to trust?
Well, I'll give you a reverse example how trust gets built. And the great example is, and how it gets destroyed, and how we caught companies gaming that. So trust got built when we actually opened up on consent data of consumers so they can self give that data, triangulate the data and data on their personal revenue. Let's say a small shopkeeper, what payments they are receiving, to what has been their tax. The VAT kind of tax, what is called indirect tax, GST in India, data on that. And that really showed their purchasing. So revenue side and the purchasing side. And the third was their taxation data, the direct tax, income tax data. We actually, as a government, set out an algorithm where they can feed this and they could get an approval for a loan, for a banking loan, up to UK £100,000, US £150,000, give or take. And this was pre-approved in less than 59 minutes. So this was an initiative by the government which sets up its own kind of a algorithm, a data-driven algorithm to give you a credit score as well as a credit approval right there on the fly. And you could take that approval and go to any bank, any bank, and say, "This is I'm pre-approved, and you have to give me credit." So this is something that really enabled a lot of trust. More than 20 million small retailers availed of this algorithmic approvals and went out, and they could see the trust in technology. If they share the data, they will get credit. And then on the other hand, we found more than 600 predatory loaning applications who were out there, again of origins from many different countries, who were actually using that data to give you predatory loans, sometimes not even disapproving you just because they wanted to suck up your data. And that created a lot of bad faith. So I think, a lot of open algorithmic transparency and public-private partnership is required for walking this tightrope on gaining trust of the consumers. We have both examples. The very good example of trust I've given you is an algorithm run by the government, and the poorer examples are run by private, dubious operators who's then they had to face legal action.
Thank you. Really interesting. And Anna-Liisa, have you got any examples from Estonia around kind of algorithms being used for public decisions and what the outcomes were and whether it built or broke trust? I know in the UK we had an example where students received the incorrect or students from state schools received lower A-level results than students from fee-paying schools during the pandemic, which arguably broke a lot of trust, destroyed trust a generation in algorithms?
Yes, thank you. Actually, no, we haven't had this kind of like negative outcomes or implications of using AI in public service delivery. And actually, what we are doing is that we are moving towards even more AI-powered e-government. So basically, the main idea is to provide public sector services as a seamless service, which is based on the citizens or businesses events, life events, for example. So this allows to have more human-centric approach. It's more convenient for the citizens, and also, all this complexity of how the state functions, how different authorities are communicating to each other. This is on the background, and it's basically invisible to the people using these services. So this is one of the, I would say, like more strategic goals and objectives towards which we are moving. But also we have quite many AI use cases across public service, across public sector. So in different fields, and the number is constantly growing. So I would say in this regard, where we have this positive stance towards increasing the role of AI in our in our government operations, but luckily so far, yes, all the feedback has been quite positive. So no issues there at the moment.
Excellent. I mean, so we have 15 minutes left of the panel. So if people want to send their questions in, please do so. I have a burning question, and I'll put it to Bradley first. Where do we think, if we have a kind of a crystal ball, where do we think the next digital trust issues arise? We have the social media platforms and the disinformation that creates. And do you have a view on where the next issues are going to be?
The metaverse. So it seems to me that everything good about Internet 2.0 and everything bad about Internet 2.0 will be magnified by a factor of 10 when the metaverse comes. Now, while it's still sort of a concept, we know that companies like Microsoft and Facebook and Apple are spending tens of billions of dollars on developing it. So I think the likelihood of it coming out in the next couple of years is pretty high. But all of the things that we have failed, at least in the US, to address, whether it's data portability or interoperability or privacy or consumer protection or taxation or everything else, that's a problem today, will be a significantly greater problem once the metaverse is here. I put out a memo a couple of months ago with some ideas around how we could think about regulating the metaverse. It got a lot of press here in the US. I said to about 30 different politicians that I'm friendly with, no one had any idea what to do with it whatsoever. And so while it's very clear to me that these problems are coming and need to be addressed, it's also clear to me that we don't have the political sort of ability or infrastructure to actually deal with them.
And in summary, what would you say that's kind of the top three problems with the metaverse?
Yeah. So number one is protection, right? So harassment, targeting of children, exploitation. There's already an example in a test version of the metaverse where a woman was assaulted and harassed digitally. So clearly that's going to be a problem. So number one, I'd say, is safety. Number two would be data rights. In the US, we really don't have any rights to our own data at all. But the notion that you're going to create an avatar that is a true expression of who you are, and then you have to recreate it for every single metaverse because Facebook doesn't want you to have the same thing that Apple lets you have, that Microsoft lets you have, is crazy. And there's got to be interoperability here in the metaverse. And the third, to me, is more an issue that government needs to worry about, and I think they're probably not going to until it's too late, which is taxation, in that once a significant amount of the economy moves into the metaverse and digital services are really covering a lot of purchases, it becomes very easy for people to avoid paying state and local sales taxes on it, right? You have a good VPN, and then all of a sudden, the taxes disappear, especially if people are paying in crypto. And my view is that when the metaverse comes, that's when crypto goes from being an asset class to an actual currency. And so I think the revenue losses that U.S. governments are facing are tremendous, and they don't realize that at all, and they're going to pay the price for it.
Brilliant, thank you. Joanna, do you have a view on kind of crystal ball gate? What's the next issue?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Bradley that, you know, if you take the problems of the internet and Web 2, then yes, they're going to be magnified in the metaverse, and it's really important to, while the metaverse is at an early stage, to be starting to think about how do you create trust in that environment? How do you make sure those problems aren't repeated? I think there's sort of three components to trust. There's the regulators and the policymakers and what they can do to help create trust. You've got the corporations themselves, so the tech companies of all sizes and what they can do. But it's really important not to forget that we're talking about users. I mean, it's users who create content, it's users whose data is involved. And so there's a huge piece around media literacy and safety and teaching people how to be safe online and how to protect their data, etc. And look, we're seeing lots of initiatives sort of globally by governments, by regulators, by the tech company themselves to try and empower people and teach them that. So I think one of the problems and one of the real risks to trust is actually new stuff, because we don't know as users, we're not used to it, we don't understand it, and we don't know what the risks are. And a good example of that, I would say, is deepfakes. We're all used to trusting audiovisual media content. We might not trust written text, but we're used to trusting a video. So you're trusting that this is me talking and I haven't been edited or deepfaked in some way. Well, actually, we can't trust in that way anymore. And so we need to be teaching users what they should be looking out for, what they should be aware of. And it's really important to sort of tackle that at an early stage. So getting out there, talking to children in particular about, you know, how can you be safe online? How can you trust? And I think once we've tackled that third component, so sort of empowering users, then I think that will really help the sort of trust overall.
Brilliant, thank you. Arvind, what's your view on kind of the future issues?
I think apart from what Bradley has already talked about or Joanna has said about deep fakes, I think fake news as an information pandemic that we are going to see is only going to multiply, and I think there needs to be a lot more algorithm set up to detect and mark fake news before it starts spreading, and that will be a very big that's a very big concern that I have, because that has impact on democracies, that has impact on people's mind and everything else. The second thing, apart from, again, as I said, just building upon what the fellow panelists have already said, is going to be ransomware. And we have already seen with the last billion that got added to the internet is going to really reach everyone very, very soon. And in that sense, I think having global standards around cryptos, KYC norms are going to be very, very important, because ransomware in crypto, taken in crypto form, is today the most lethal way how people are getting paid for harassment, getting paid for fraud, for all other acts. So those will be the key challenging issues. And I think the third area that I again build upon is that that platforms will need to take a lot of responsibility and accountability for their actions. And I think that's going to be very, very important going forward. Metaverse is good, welcome. New technologies are always welcome, but they will, I think platforms need to recognize they will come with a host of problems and a host of issues. So what we did wrong in Web 1.0 and Web 2.0, we just want to learn from it and not repeat in Web 3.0.
Thank you. Anna-Liisa?
Yes, I would say my crystal ball gave me a quite similar answer as Joanna's. So I would also say that in more general terms, when it comes to developing new and innovative solutions or technologies, both in the public and private sector, actually, we need data for that. And this is same for everyone, but it's difficult without digital trust. So I think this is where digital skills and data literacy are crucial, because we can't expect people to trust something they don't even know how it works or how to use it. So to kind of bridge this gap and avoid that, we definitely need to raise awareness on the reliability of technology and issues related to fundamental rights and so on.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. I think where I came to was that, and kind of listening to all of your views, is that the fracturing, or for want of a better term, the balkanization of the internet seems inevitable, as we have different approaches to regulatory approaches and on what's legal in one country and what the areas of focus are. Do any of our panelists have any final thoughts on anything that's been said, or in fact around this point of how we counter this separation and this fracturing of the internet? My prediction is into 4, but it might be 5 parts. Anyone want to go?
Yeah, I would just say, I think if we're talking about the internet, then actually it's quite a personal thing. And so actually we're already seeing different internets in different jurisdictions, driven by the particular regime in that country. And sometimes that can be deeply alarming. So we've all been seeing the press around Russia and the restrictions there around the internet and access to various platforms and means of communication. But I do think it may be possible to come up with some broad principles, but you have to bear in mind that what's acceptable in one country isn't going to necessarily be acceptable in another. And so we're always going to see that sort of slight splintering of the internet. And there is a risk that we tend to look at this from a sort of our own perspective and the perspective of our own society and our own jurisdictions, whereas actually that might not necessarily be the right thing to do. So yeah, I think we're already in a the internet is differentiated across jurisdictions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Anyone else with any final thoughts? Got 3 minutes left.
I just wanted to quickly add, while what Joanna said is absolutely correct, because every country's, every democracy's, every region's laws and rules will be different. But on the other hand, internet by itself is absolutely neutral. It's a set of protocols that transfer data from one place to another. We actually we cannibalized it so much that now every country has to put its own super regulations in place to control it. So part of the fault lies when we had this advertising model run amok on the internet, and that's what I said. We let Web 1.0 run away from us. We didn't learn from it in Web 2.0. And I just hope that when Web 3.0 comes around or is already around, we have better thoughts and processes and regulation in place. Otherwise, we'll see a more splintered, balkanized internet.
Bradley, Anna-Liisa, any further views, thoughts?
No, just that given that everyone else here lives in countries or jurisdictions that have kind of done a lot better job than we have, I want to commend you. And look, it's not often that I think the U.S. should or wants to look to Europe or India for ideas. We're pretty focused on ourselves, but I think that our society would be a lot better here if our policymakers took your lead on this.
Thank you, Anna-Liisa. The final words for you. I think you're being commended by your regulatory approach within the EU.
Thank you. Yeah, just to sum up, I mean, yes, taking into account all the differences we brought out today, I mean, problems that we are facing are actually quite similar. So therefore, I believe this, having more policy coordination, sharing best practices is something that's very useful. And I mean, I think there's also like this light at the end of the tunnel, because at least between EU and US, this is something that is going on at the moment. We have this DTC, that's doing exactly that, how to align best practices and approaches to some of these very difficult issues, also related to digital trust.
Brilliant. Thanks to all of our panelists. We're now out of time, and thanks everyone for listening.